Peter, we're going to turn to you now. You know, Carter campaigned for president on this slogan, a government as good as its people. It was coming out of Watergate. It was coming out of the scandals and this kind of in-your-face energy of the last two administrations. And he famously shunned the limousine ride to walk to the White House on the day of his inauguration. First of all, that's a tradition now. I wanted to ask you, did Carter start that? And can you talk to us a little bit about how he brought the presidency back down to earth?
Yeah, that's right. He did start that. Absolutely. He didn't ask anybody's permission in advance. It was his idea. His Secret Service detail, I think, was a little bit chagrined and perhaps a little worried. It wasn't the kind of thing presidents did. But he was intent on showing humility, returning humility to the office and demonstrating his own personal humility. This is a person who actually talk the talk and walk the walk. He was always somebody of Plain roots from Plains, Georgia. He went back after his presidency to live in the same house that he and Rosalind built in 1961, a small ranch house that's worth only about $200,000 today. Hardly the palace or the estate or the ranches that people have come to imagine with other presidents. And that's because he believed humility was an important part of public service. He didn't want them to play hail to the chief when he walked in the office. He carried his own luggage onto Air Force One. He forced his aides to drive themselves to work rather than have car services pick them up. Some of that was maybe, unfortunately, over the top as far as people were concerned. He eventually kind of changed his mind on playing hail to the chief. People said it diminished the office not to have some of the grandeur that was traditionally associated with it. But it was his way of demonstrating that he was a man of the people as he saw it.
I guess if the president says I'm going to get out and walk, Secret Service is just going to have to roll with it. Reverend, I want to turn to you. I want to play a portion of an interview Carter did during Donald Trump's first term where he talks about the quality of being president. Let's take a listen.
Were you too nice to be president? Because people criticized you for your demeanor and, you might say, the energy that was brought to the job. Does America want kind of a jerk as president?
Apparently, from his recent elections, I never knew it before.
What do you think? What do you think it takes to be president? What's the one of quality that it requires to be a good president?
I used to think it was to tell the truth, but I've changed my mind lately.
I mean, I saw that for the first time last night. I somehow had missed it. It kind of broke my heart a little bit to see that admission from him. Do you think character and morality still matter in the same way when it comes to the office of the presidency?
I think that it does matter. I think that for a season, sometimes less character and less being of a certain standard and value will have a season, but it will not last. Let's remember, Jimmy Carter was elected in '76. Right after we were dealing with Watergate, where President Richard Nixon had to resign from office, and the Vietnam War. And people turned to a man who most of the voters at that time didn't even know of, and had just been governor of Georgia. First time we had a governor from the Deep South in 100 years, because they wanted character, because they wanted somebody to bring us out of what had been a disgrace with Watergate and what was an endless war in Vietnam. So he represented hope, and he never let that go. He was a deep Southerner that stood up for civil rights. He was very close with the King family, both Daddy King Sr. and Coretta Scott King, Martin III, and I talk about it often. His education department, Joe Califano, funded the Push Excel program, the education work of Reverend Jesse Jackson. So he reached out and he did things that brought the country together. It was the economy and the gas lines and things. I was in my early 20s, but I remember it, that cost him, I think, his defeat. But he never, ever lowered his standards. When I had my several encounters with him, he always asked me about my prayer life, always talked about his faith. And I think that the country will get back to that after we go through this season that he referred to in his interview with Stephen Colbert.
Jonathan, in your book, the way you wrote it, it changed the way a lot of people viewed Carter's presidency. You know, he only had the one term, which can be sometimes looked at as, you know, a bit of a failure, at the very least, a mixed legacy. But you write about how he really altered aspects of the office in ways that still shape the way it operates today. I was reading, you know, he elevated the vice president, brought him in on decisions, started other departments. Can you walk us through what the biggest legacies in the way the White House operates are from the Carter administration?
Yeah, there were a number of changes. You mentioned two very important ones. You know, before that, the vice presidency was, as FDR's first vice president, John Nance Garner, said, you know, worth a warm bucket of spit. And that's the way vice presidents were viewed, that they didn't really have anything to do except go to funerals. And Carter decided he wanted to do something different. And so when he named Fritz Mondale, Walter Mondale, the ticket, they struck a deal where Mondale would be, for instance, in the chain of military command, which no vice president had ever been before. He gave him an office in the West Wing, which vice presidents had not had before. He did the same thing with the role of First Lady. Rosalynn Carter, to whom he was married for 77 years, was a very close advisor, and she was the first lady who was given her own offices in the East Wing, which most first ladies since then have done. They've wanted to do big things, which she did. And you know, he also he overhauled the civil service for the first time in 100 years, reformed it so that it worked better for the people. And there are a whole series of new departments. The Department of Education, FEMA, was started in the Carter administration. And I could go down through a whole series of other things that he did, a couple of which became important in recent history. FISA courts, another innovation of the Carter administration. So this was a much more productive domestic agenda than most people realize. They kind of go, oh, mediocre president because he was swamped by events in the last 2 years of his presidency. Great former president. The truth is more complicated than that. And he did make a number of mistakes. But at the end of the day, he was a political failure since he lost to Ronald Reagan by a large margin, but a substantive and often visionary success, especially on the environment and clean energy.
Peter, I want to ask you, Joe Biden was the first sitting senator to endorse Carter for president in 1976. Take a listen to how he answered a question yesterday on Carter's inspiration.
Mr. President, as you think about your post-presidency, is there anything about Jimmy Carter's time after leaving office that inspired you for the years ahead?
Yeah, never give up hope. Never give up hope. I mean it from the bottom of my heart. So much negativism out there. I know you're tired of hearing me say it over the last 4 years. But folks, there's nothing beyond our capacity. Nothing beyond our capacity. If we do it together. And I mean it. I mean it. And he believed it.
Peter, this seemed to really impact President Biden yesterday. Do you think he sees a little bit of himself in Carter? And what are you expecting to hear from him when he gives the eulogy, knowing that, you know, Biden himself is about to embark on his post-White House life?
Yeah, I think there's a real serendipity of this moment, right? Here you have another one-term Democratic president who struggled with inflation, who is struggling now at the last hostages out before he leaves office from a Middle East dungeon, in effect, who accomplished a lot, as Jonathan said, about President Carter, but was maybe unappreciated and unable to translate into the political support that he wanted to have for a second term. Now, they're very different people in a lot of ways. Biden was really a creature of Washington. Carter was not. But there was, I think, some real connection there. And you're showing that picture of President Biden visiting with former President Carter in Plains, Georgia. That was in 2021. Biden was the first sitting president ever to do that, ever to make the trek to Plains to honor the former president in person the way he did. So I think, in fact, in some ways, Biden had the closest relationship with Carter of all of the former and sitting presidents that he has encountered over the years since Gerald Ford, with whom Carter struck a real friendship.
And Reverend, you posted a photo last year with President Carter, and in the post, you said that every time you'd been around him, you left knowing you'd been in the presence of a sincere, grounded, and God-fearing man. Can you talk a little bit about President Carter's faith and how significant it was to him throughout his life?
It was very significant. The picture you show was at the 50th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington in 2013 that Martin Luther King III and I chaired. And I was talking there at the foot of the Lincoln statue there at Lincoln Memorial to President Clinton and President Carter. And when Clinton and I got finished talking, President Carter kind of touched my arm. He says, "How you doing with your ministry, Al? I see you out there with your activism. Don't leave your ministry." I said, "Well, that is my ministry, President Carter, and I preach every Sunday at a church. I don't want to pastor church. I want to run my national organization, but I'm still very much committed to my ministry." He said, "Keep your prayer life going." And you could tell he sincerely meant it. He was not one that talked about his religion as a political kind of something that you could say to win voters. He meant that. He taught Sunday school until he couldn't teach it anymore, and he would talk about it. He would know Bible verses. He could really, in many ways, delve into the scriptures and give interpretation. And this was something that was rare with politicians, less known presidents. I think in some ways, as I was listening to you talk about Joe Biden, it reminded me one Saturday when President Biden called me. He had just left Mass, and we were talking about some issue. And I don't remember many presidents other than Jimmy Carter that even openly went to church when it wasn't a political event until Joe Biden.